Okay, so I'm here with Mark Verstraete for the first annual online undergrad ethics conference, and Mark is an undergraduate student at the University of Georgia in Athens, and he's soon to graduate with a bachelor's in philosophy, and he's sort of weighing the options with regard to philosophy grad school, and I'm very happy to be speaking to him right now. And I guess what we're going to do is we'll start out with you providing a kind of overview of your views on the topic. The title of your paper is Biocentrism, an Intriguing Formulation. So you are a biocentrist, I take it. That's right, right?
That's correct, at least for the purpose of this paper.
Okay, so but those are not your sincere views?
No, I mean, I believe that nature can have moral standing outside of instrumental value for humans, so I guess that is biocentrism in kind of a slightly altered form, and that's what I'm trying to get at this paper, is that there are subtleties within biocentrism that can make them more appealing and not open to the criticisms that are generally launched at biocentrism as a whole.
Okay, good. So, you know, this is a topic that I mean, I'm hoping I'll learn something from you about this. I don't have a lot of firm views about most of these issues. I taught environmental ethics here at Coastal Carolina University last semester, but I still don't know for sure what to say about most of this stuff. So I guess what we were thinking we do is you would start out and give a kind of overview of the topic and what you're trying to do in the paper, and then I'll come in with some questions and thoughts.
Great. So just to give a brief overview of the paper is, I argue that nature, and the type of nature I'm referring to in this paper is biotic nature. So not in the Aldo Leopold sense of rocks and mountains as nature, but biological nature. And I'm arguing that biological nature can have moral standing outside of humans. So nature can have moral standing in itself and not in relation to human agents. And through the paper, I outline it can be conceptualized as consisting of two parts. So positive arguments for biocentrism, and I ground this in that biotic life has biological interests, and fulfilling of these interests is something good in itself, and from that we can logically conclude that biotic life has value in itself. And then I also have a section where I address negative arguments, and so here I'm saying that any argument, or every argument that I've encountered for human superiority, has been question begging. That is, it assumes that some quality that humans have is essential, and from there it summarizes that humans somehow have like an ontological break from nature, and I'm saying that those qualities are kind of picked arbitrarily.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Is that all you want to say by way of introduction?
Oh yeah, that pretty much covers it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess you know. So maybe one question to start out with is seems like you're saying, so you're saying that everything that's alive is due moral consideration.
That's correct.
And so that includes trees and ladybugs and HIV and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's actually a section where I address HIV.
Right. Yeah, that's why I mentioned it.
Okay.
I mean, I guess HIV we might not want to include here because it's not clear that it's alive, or somebody might try to cause problems for that. But even if we ended up saying HIV is not alive, we probably want to say that like single-celled bacteria is alive, or whatever. There are relevantly similar tiny little organisms that that you will say are due some kind of moral consideration.
Correct.
And at the same time, you're saying that things that are not alive are not due moral consideration.
Well, that's not the case. I'm saying that under this theory, they're outside this scope. So maybe there are other reasons why they have moral consideration, but I'm not addressing those here.
Okay. So, for example, a mousetrap, you're just not concerned one way or the other with whether it's due moral consideration.
Yeah, but I was more focusing on mountains and that abiotic nature,
Right.
but that's still outside the scope of what I'm addressing here.
Uh-huh. And the reason why you want to say that a tree, for example, is due moral consideration is that it has interests.
That's correct.
And when we say that it has interests, I take it by that you mean that there are ways for things to go well for it and ways for things to go badly for it.
Correct.
And I suppose that that's the case with a number of inanimate objects as well, non-living objects. So lawnmowers, if you leave a lawnmower out in the rain for a very long time, that's probably not good for the lawnmower. If I disengage the spring in a mousetrap, then that's going to interfere with the mousetrap functioning properly as a mousetrap. And so there's a sense in which that's not good for the mousetrap. So it seems like I'm sort of suggesting the possibility that you might be committed to say that mousetraps and lawnmowers and things like that are due moral consideration. So I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, you say you're not that interested in going one way or the other about inanimate objects, but what are your inclinations with regard to such things?
Yeah, well, first of all, the way I grounded biocentrism in this paper is that it's in virtue of biological interest. I think there's something different between the satisfaction of interest for, say, a lawnmower and the satisfaction of interest for something biological, that is, a tree getting the proper requirements to continue living.
So what's the difference?
And honestly, that's a great question, because the relevant distinction between the inanimate objects and the biological difference is that these biological organisms are hooked into a system, so like kind of a Darwinian evolutionary system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from that there arises kind of a relevant distinction between the two. It's based on that system and kind of intuition, which is it's a little loose. But I think there's a way to claim that there is something different between those two cases.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it seems to me that there's a couple ways you could go with that. So one possibility is to say that the simple fact that organisms are evolved, whereas lawnmowers are not evolved, that's the relevant difference.
Yeah, that's kind of the Darwinian system that I was gesturing towards.
And then the other way you could go is to say, well, organisms are part of an ecosystem. They belong to this kind of interlocking, well, they play this role in an ecosystem that includes other organisms of the same species as well as many other organisms of different species, and somehow their participation in that big system is so that's an unimportant fact about them, whereas the lawnmower isn't quite like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, but my concern there is that if we look at it from the view of the ecosystem, then we're kind of getting into being committed to the rocks and mountains and the non-living nature, so to speak, that I was kind of trying to avoid. But I guess that's not a serious problem for the theory to include pieces of the ecosystem that aren't biological life, but it gets a little messy.
I mean, for me, it would be a big problem for the view if we ended up having to say that rocks and mountains matter, but it would even be worse to have to say that lawnmowers and mousetraps matter. I mean, for the thought that a mousetrap is due any sort of moral consideration apart from its purely instrumental value, that strikes me as deeply problematic intuitively. I mean, do you have the same intuition, or are you a little bit more open to the possibility that mousetraps might deserve some amount of moral considerability? We might say that they don't deserve very much, but maybe they should get a little bit. What are your intuitions on that?
My intuitions here that if the theory is construed to include mousetraps and other things of that nature, then all the support and kind of sting of the theory gets dissolved. I mean, it just becomes too weak if we have to apply it to mousetraps as well.
Right. Well, I mean, you could go the route that you go with HIV, because I think when you talk about HIV, if I'm not mistaken, what you want to say about that is that, correct me if I'm wrong about this, your view on HIV is that HIV is due a certain amount of moral considerability, or again, if we don't want to classify HIV as being alive, a bacterium might be due a certain amount of moral consideration. It's just that moral consideration is very easily outweighed because it's not very much. So we should give them their interests some weight, but we can easily outweigh them by pointing to human interests and not being sick or whatever. And so you might want to say the same thing about the lawnmower. Well, yeah, it deserves some consideration, but almost none, and it's very easily overridden by other considerations. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that angle on this?
Yeah, referring to a continuum to include a lawnmower and mousetrap. On the face of it, it doesn't really seem problematic that we can just assign it kind of a very small amount of moral consideration, but it just seems like that if we are forced to assign it any moral consideration, that would be kind of reductio against the argument as a whole. That is, it just leads to, many people think that that's an absurd conclusion to have, and because we arrive at that conclusion, then that's a strike against the theory at large.
Mm-hmm. So I guess another line of questioning for you has to do with the alternatives to your position. So I suppose that I mean, if I had to pick a view in this neighborhood, I would want to be a sentientist. I would want to say that in order to be worthy, in order to deserve moral consideration, you've got to be sentient. And I take it that means, at least in large part, that there's got to be something that it's like to be you. If you're due moral consideration, there's got to be something that it's like to be you. There's got to be some kind of capacity for subjective experience. There's got to be the possibility for positive and negative experience, pain, pleasure, and all that kind of stuff. And if you're not even capable of that stuff, and if you never will be, so if we can be sure that you'll never have any sort of an experience of the sort with which we're familiar, then you don't deserve any moral consideration at all. So you're on the other side of that. You want to oppose this position. And I guess, like if I had to try to describe how I arrive at this sort of position, here's what I'd say. I'd say the one thing that I'm really confident about is that I'm due some moral consideration. So I deserve to be. So, for example, if something is going to cause me some pain, then that's a reason not to do it to me. So I'm quite confident about that. And then I recognize that the sorts of positive and negative experiences that I think are morally important in me are also present in biologically similar organisms. So, for example, other human beings are capable of those same sorts of experiences, and it happens that even many animals are. So pigs, for example, have experiences that are similar in various ways to human experiences. They can't enjoy a symphony, but if a pig breaks its leg, then it's going to feel very similar to the way I feel. Anyway, there's going to be some similarity there. It's going to be bad. And so it seems like that gives me a reason to think that the pig matters in something like the same way that I matter. So the ground, the basis for my own moral consideration is shared by other sentient beings. But then when I turn to living things that are not sentient, like bacteria and so on, I find that they don't have any of those sorts of, those bases are totally missing. Now, it might be that there, as I think you sort of articulated this point earlier, it might be that there's some other sort of basis for moral considerability besides simply the capacity for positive and negative experiences. But it doesn't seem to me that we're familiar with any such basis. This seems like it would be quite alien to human experience if there were such a thing, if there were something worthy of moral consideration other than beings that are capable of having positive and negative experiences. So I guess I would want to be sort of like agnostic about this kind of value that you're suggesting attaches to trees and bacteria and so on. I would want to say, well, maybe they're due some moral consideration, but if they are, it's for reasons that I'm completely unfamiliar with and that I can't find anywhere in my own experience. By contrast, I can find reasons to prevent pain in my own experience. I can tell that pain is bad just by consulting my own memories of having experienced pain. So anyway, I mean, that was kind of a long-winded description of why I would want to be a sentientist rather than a biocentrist. And I guess I'm just hoping that you'll talk me out of this view and talk me over to your view.
Well, what I would say to that is, I think you make good points about abstracting moral consideration from your own experiences, but I don't think that's the only way to ground moral consideration. Kind of what I'm doing here in the paper is arguing that even these non-sentient organisms are still hooked into a system at large. So in the paper, I'll actually address the tardigrade, which is a small insect capable of survival at very extreme temperatures, extreme pressure. And so because this organism is able to do these things, it has the capacity to survive. I think that there's something to be said for enabling it to survive and just not having like a wanton disregard for its interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, like, if there's something that's in some way going to affect me, but it's not going to affect any of my experiences, so I'll never have any knowledge that it affects me. I don't know. I guess I have a hard time getting my head around the idea that I should try to prevent that thing from affecting me in that way. And I guess that's part of the reason why I think this an organism that's incapable of having any experiences at all. It's just hard for me to get my head around it. But I mean, this is just like dueling intuitions.
Yeah, no, but I just kind of want to make a quick clarification that it's not that these organisms make some kind of claim on us. It's that they do make a claim, but it's not, you don't have to continuously be going out of your way to save ladybugs all day. It's just that you can't have a wanton disregard for their interests. You can't like go out of the way to harm them. Right.
Right. So your view, as I understand it, is that we don't have an obligation to aid them necessarily, but we do have an obligation not to frustrate their interests in a sort of direct way.
That's correct.
So what about parts of organisms?
I'm not really sure I understand where you're going with this.
So like, it seems like my kidney can do well or badly in the same way that I can do well or badly. I mean, and it seems like maybe my kidney has interests like things can go very badly for my kidney, I take it. I mean, my
It,
kidney isn't. I mean, I suppose there's a sense in which my kidney is alive.
yeah, but I think that looking at the interests of parts of organisms, just yes, they have interests, but the the locus of moral consideration is the organism itself.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think we need to ascribe moral consideration to the individual parts, but instead that's moral consideration to the organism as a whole.
Mhm. And why is that?
Because it's not the kidney that has interest. The kidney doesn't care if something goes well or badly for it. It's the organism that has the interests.
Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't think that a bacterium would care either. I mean, it doesn't seem like that your view requires that everything worthy of moral consideration cares, whether it's uh,
Well,
yeah.
it's care in a very loose sense, that kind of that Darwinian care. It wants to reproduce and pass its genetic material on.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it's not the kidney, it's the organism.
I mean, I've heard that there's actually a sort of evolution. There are sort of evolutionary processes that go on within organisms. So I think, for example, there are evolutionary processes that are responsible for the way that the immune system works. And I suppose I shouldn't have brought that up unless it's true, and I don't know whether it's true. I believe I've heard this, and I'll try to see if I can find
I
a.
mean, we can run with it as a hypothetical.
Yeah,
So
let's
let's
do
see.
that.
Yeah, okay, let's see. Can you cash it out kind of more fully?
Okay, so if we're just doing this hypothetically, then that gives me a lot more leeway. So I think so. Here, in this hypothetical scenario, suppose that the way that your immune system responds to an infection or something is by producing a variety of different white blood cells that differ in various ways, and some of them work really well to destroy the infection, and some of them don't work very well at all. And then suppose there's some kind of a process that results in the destruction of the ones that don't work and results in the propagation of the ones that do work. And so eventually you've got all these white blood cells that are multiplying in your system, and they're succeeding in destroying the infection, or destroying whatever's causing the infection. And so this would be sort of like an evolutionary process that would be responsible for the white blood cells that are in your bloodstream in something like the same way that there's an evolutionary process that's responsible for the success of a certain type of organism in an ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, there are similarities, but I don't think you can map that evolutionary system onto like Darwinian natural selection. And it's the case because in the hypothetical that we're cashing out, it's kind of the things that work well are continued, but it's not that the individual white blood cells are passing on genetic material to like, uh, propagate the genes that make them survival conducive. So, in a sense, it's not the white blood cells themselves that are relevant. It's kind of they're being spawned by a different entity, and then the things that don't work well are just kind of being withered away, if you will. Do you kind of see
Mhm.
where I'm going with that, or?
I do. It sounds like for you, the passing on of genetic material is really important. It's not just that we're looking at at a sort of generically evolutionary process. It has to be very close to the evolutionary process that we know in biology.
Yeah, I think a question that arises here that we're kind of gesturing towards is, what about organisms that don't have the capacity to reproduce? Can they still be grounded with interests? Um,
What do
so,
you think about that?
yeah, I mean, I don't think it's reproduction at large. I think, well, for here, obviously, like, we can abstract that people who aren't able to reproduce have moral interests. Like, there's something like it's proper for them to have their biological needs satisfied. And then, like you said in your sentious view, we can abstract that quality to a certain level, but I think this is kind of a strange hypothetical, but can we ground moral consideration for a ladybug that lacks reproductive capacities?
I mean, are you asking me what my view about that is, or are you asking?
I mean, I kind of can guess what your view would be, but
Yeah. I mean, a related question is, what about organisms that didn't evolve? I mean, we could imagine, like, I don't know, there's a famous example about a swamp creature. Lightning strikes a swamp, and somehow the particles in the swamp are arranged in just the right way to create some kind of a living thing, like a person, or maybe a pig, or a ladybug, or whatever. And it comes out of the swamp, so it has no evolutionary origin. It just, by some freak chance, it came into existence. And I suppose that, on your view, such a being would be, I don't know, I mean, what do you think about, would such a being be do any moral consideration at all?
yeah, well, kind of the root of the biocentric ethic is a satisfaction of biological interests. So even with the ladybug, even though it's not completely aware of these interests, there's something good in itself about satisfying these interests. So considering that Swamp Man has biological interests, it's good in itself when these interests are satisfied.
Mm. I mean, I guess what I would want to be, if I were you, is kind of like a pluralist. So I'd want to say that, various hedonic considerations matter, but then there are other things like satisfaction of interests, and frustration of a thing's biological role and stuff like that, and those things matter too, even if they don't affect happiness or pain or anything like that.
Yeah, because for the ladybug, obviously, satisfaction of interest is not hooked into kind of a pleasure-pain calculation like it would be for a human.
Right. I wonder how long we've been going. We probably have. I bet most of the people that started watching have ceased watching by now.
I mean, I think it's pretty interesting, so it's in
No,
their best interest to remain tuned in.
do we have any? So, do you have any remaining thoughts that you'd like to share or explore in this conversation?
Well, we kind of left the question open about the ladybug who lacked reproductive capacities, and I just kind of want to intimate one more time that this entity does have interest. I mean, the question of how aware the ladybug is of these interests is debatable, but still the satisfaction of biological interest is something good in itself. And from that we can abstract to satisfaction of interest should not be thwarted by humans just without due reason.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I have sympathy with your overall view, and to a certain extent. I mean, it does seem like reasonless destruction of these parts of the natural world is a bad thing. If I've got nothing to say in favor of doing it, it seems like there's something wrong with me if I do it. And your view can explain that in a way that the sentientist view is unable to explain it. So I think that's a pretty big count in favor of your view. And I mean, this is a point that you make. I think this is one of the big advantages for your view that I think you take it to have, is that it can explain our intuitions about just reasonless destruction of the natural world. I'm just mentioning an advantage for your view, I think.
No, I mean, I completely agree. That's one thing that the biocentrists can explain, the intuitions for why wanton destruction is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Um, okay, well, I'm not sure I have any other. I don't have any other objections to raise, and I'm not sure I have much in the way of other things to say. So should we just end it there?
Um, yeah, that works for me.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for doing this. I got a lot out of it, and I hope that people who are watching also get something out of it. So I guess I'll talk to you soon, I hope.
All right, great.
Thanks.
Thank you.